Good morning, everyone. I'd like to extend my thanks to the organizers of this meeting for inviting me to attend it. My name is Mahouton Norbert Hounkonnou. I'm the president of the Network of African Science Academies, and it is my honor to moderate this session about financial, academic freedom, and open access. So, this session stands at the confluence of three forces that shape the global landscape of knowledge and its freedom: the political economy of research financing, the ethical imperatives of academic freedom, and the democratizing promise of open science. Our network has long defended the rights of scholars to pursue knowledge without coercion, censorship, or fear. As the UNESCO recommendation on science and scientific researchers remind us, scientific freedom is not a privilege, but a necessity. Yet today, even this necessity is precarious. Financial constraints, whether imposed by states, markets, or private interests, can have profound consequences for the autonomy of inquiry. In some contexts, funding cuts or conditional grants have become subtle tools of ideological control. In others, entire institutions face economic pressures that lead to self-censorship or disengagement from sensitive topics. As Amartya Sen, an Indian economist and philosopher, once wrote in 2009, the freedom to think, to investigate, and to dissent is not a luxury. It is part of the foundational architecture of a just society. So, at the same time, the global open access movement, long driven by the ideal of knowledge as a public good, is itself shaped by asymmetries of power. Pay to publish models, article processing charges, and unequal infrastructure and entrenching inequalities between institutions of the global north and global south, between the well-funded and the under-resourced. So, it is in this context that we should recall the 2024 Network of African Science Academy statement on open science, which affirms that open science embodies the ideals of transparency, collaboration, and accessibility, fostering an environment conducive to accelerated discovery and the equitable dissemination of knowledge. Importantly, our network highlights that open science must be guided by the principle as open as possible, as closed as necessary. A reminder that openness requires balance with ethical, legal, and socio-economic considerations. This principle recognizes the legislative environment, the critical socio-economic role of intellectual property rights, and ethical, environmental, contractual, and research credibility considerations. The statement also warns against predatory journals publishing and stresses that inclusivity, trust, and contextual relevance are essential if Africa and the wider world are to reap the full benefits of open science. This NASDAQ position resonates deeply with a broader global movement. As some authors have argued, open science cannot be reduced to open platforms. It must also mean open participation. Indeed, open science must not only democratize access to results, but also expand opportunities for contribution from the global south as much as from the global north, from young scholars and much as established ones, from indigenous knowledge systems as much as high-tech laboratories. So, how then do we defend the freedom to research, the freedom to publish, and the freedom to share, while also ensuring that the structures of support are just, transparent, and globally inclusive? This panel invites us to grapple with such questions, structural, normative, and deeply human. Our discussion today is not just about policy or publishing. It is about the ethics of knowledge in the fractured world. What does it mean to secure academic freedom when funding is scarce? What does openness mean when so many are still locked out? How do we design systems that are both globally connected and locally responsive? I invite our panelists, whose expertise spans disciplines, institutions, and continents, to illuminate these tensions and help us reimagine solutions. And I invite each of you, members of this unique global network, to help carry forward the commitment to scholarship that is both rigorous and free, inclusive and just. So thank you for your kind attention, and allow me to open the panel discussions. Our panelists, the first one, Professor Porsdam, is Professor of History and Cultural Rights at the University of Copenhagen, where she also holds a UNESCO chair in the right to science. She divides her time between the History Department, Faculty of the Humanities, where she teaches American history, and the Faculty of Law, where she teaches human rights and legal sociology and philosophy. Among her recent publications may be mentioned Science as a Cultural Human Right and The Transforming Power of Cultural Rights. She co-edited The Right to Science, then and now, and co-authored Scientific Freedom, The Heart of the Right to Science in 2024. The second panelist, Mark Wuddivira, is Dean of the Faculty of Food and Agriculture at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, and a professor of environmental soil physics. He is a fellow and the president of the Caribbean Academy of Science. He is a member of the International Science Council's Small Island Developing State Liaison Committee, a recognized expert in agricultural and environmental science. His work has been widely published in reputable journals, and he's frequently invited to deliver keynote, expert, and panel presentation at high-level meetings. A leading figure in the academic and scientific communities, he champions the amplification of the voice of science in enhancing resilient development in vulnerable regions. He chairs the editorial board of Tropical Agriculture Journal and is an associate editor of the Journal of Plant Nutrition and Soil Science, published by Helle. He serves on various steering committees and advisory boards. Professor Peter Ottersen was the University of Oslo's elected president, 2009-2017, and served as the president of Karolinska Institutet in Sweden, 2017 to 2023. Ole Peter Ottersen was director of one of Norway's centers of excellence, Center for Molecular Biology and Neuroscience, 2002-2009, and chaired the Lancet University of Oslo Commission on Global Governance for Health, 2011 to 2014. He was founding chair 2016 to 2017 and acting general secretary 2023 to 2024 of the Guild of European Research Intensive Universities, a European university network that is headquartered in Brussels and that aims to contribute to the EU research, health, and innovation agenda. Ottersen is co-founder of One Europe for Global Health. He is currently professor and chair of the Sustainable Health Unit of the University of Oslo, visiting professor at Charité Berlin, vice president of Wisho Foundation, and co-chair of a new Lancet Commission on Global Governance for Health. So, you now well know our panelists, and I'd like to invite Professor Porsdam to provide remarks. Please, Professor.
Okay. Who actually owns academia, and what implications does ownership structures have for the freedom of science and academic freedom? These are some of the questions that we want to discuss in the session, session 5. In my own scholarly work, I have focused on the human right to science for the past few years. And no matter what one does on the human right to science or other cultural human rights, issues of ownership keep coming up all the time. Who owns what is produced, what is generated in science, in culture, in the arts? So I'd like to open this session and to spend my 10 minutes on the issue of ownership. And I want to make 3 broad points. The first one is that intellectual property rights often will clash with scientific freedom. The second one is that there is an incoherent view of intellectual property rights within the United Nations system itself, and that this tends to confuse the issue. It's unfortunate. And the third point I want to make is that a cultural human rights approach may, perhaps, help to push back against the worst kind of commercialization and privatization of science and scholarly research. Unlike academic freedom, which is inferred from various other human rights, scientific freedom is actually mentioned directly, protected directly in Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, one of the founding and most important human rights instruments. The wording is that, and I quote, "The states parties to the present covenant undertake to respect the freedom indispensable for scientific research and creative activity." So we have that wording right there in one of the founding human rights instruments. In my own work, I've argued for scientific freedom as a constitutive, a very important element of the right to science, and that it has three core, or suggested that it has three core elements: freedom from interference in science, freedom to participate in science, and freedom to access science. And in general, without scientific freedom, there's going to be none of that progress, scientific progress, that from which everyone is going to benefit, according to the first part of Article 15 in that covenant. The wording of that part that I'm referring to here, Article 15.1, that's the one that talks about the right everybody has to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. It is that's what I abbreviate to the right to science. In this first part of Article 15, Article 15 has 4 parts, and in this first part we find these rights outlined. The 3 other parts are about the obligations that states parties have vis-à-vis making sure that people have the right to science. And one of these is the one that concerns scientific freedom that I just mentioned. Now, in this first part of Article 15, we find 3 of the 4 core cultural human rights outlined. In addition to the right to science, it's also the right to participate in cultural life, or just the right to culture, and then it's authors' rights. And by the way, the 4th core cultural human right is the right to education. But in our context today, it's authors' rights that are especially interesting. The wording in the article is that everybody has the right to benefit from the protection of the moral and material interests resulting from any scientific, literary, or artistic production of which he is the author. So what does that mean, this long and complicated sentence? Authors' rights concern the reputation and the integrity of authors and creators. The right to be mentioned as the author of a work, for example, as the creator of some knowledge. And it also is about the right to prevent or object to the mutilation of one's work, what happens to one's work afterwards. So these are a very different kind of rights from intellectual property rights. Authors' rights are personal rights, rights that a person has forever, and they are inalienable, as lawyers call them, human rights, which means that they cannot be transferred to others. And as an expression of human creativity, they have absolutely no economic value. This is not about economics. It's about something else. As opposed to that, or in contrast to that, intellectual property rights are alienable. They are private property rights. They are a monopoly for a finite period of time. Human rights, including cultural human rights, belong within the public goods-oriented system of the UN and UNESCO. Here we're talking about science as a public common good. Whereas when we talk about intellectual property, these are regulated under the auspices of the WIPO WTO system of privatized rights. WIPO is the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is affiliated with the World Trade Organization. Human rights, including cultural human rights and the right to science, are universal, and they are openly accessible to everyone. Again, we are in this common public common good scheme of things. Not so when we talk about intellectual property. Here, access is restricted, because once something is protected by intellectual property, they become privatized and they are taken out of the public domain, and people have to pay to use them. These 2 systems have evolved separately, and they work in different ways. So we have 2 very different views of science, of who owns and who has access to science, represented within the UN system itself. And the pertinent question in our context today is, whether this wording, to benefit from the protection of the moral and material interests, whether that actually it means that intellectual property rights are human rights. Is that what this particular part of Article 15 says? And scholars with an interest in the right to science have debated this for a long, long time. The gist of many relevant UN documents and reports, such as those written by the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights. Here's the first one of those Special Rapporteurs, Farida Shahid, pictured. The gist of her reports is that intellectual property rights are not human rights. There is no human right to patent protection, she wrote in her report on patents and cultural rights. Where patent rights and human rights are at conflict, human rights must prevail. Patents and copyright must never extend so far as to interfere with individuals' dignity and well-being. And in fact, comparing intellectual property regimes with the wording of Article 15(1)(c) is deceptive, she argues, because cultural rights, like all other human rights, are precisely inalienable. That is, again, they cannot be transferred to others. Whereas intellectual property is a monopoly that you have for a particular period of time, typically in the case of patents, 20 years. And after this time, the intellectual property protected items then knowledge falls into the public domain and can be used free of charge by everybody. So what Shahid does is that she ties the material interest of creators and authors to the enjoyment of an adequate standard of living instead. Like any other type of work, scientific and artistic work can be protected, she says, by measures that go beyond intellectual property, such as minimum wage protections, collective bargaining power, social security guarantees, and general budgetary support for science and the arts. But the problem is that within the UN system itself, there is a certain disagreement about this. And this tends to muddy the waters, which is unfortunate. 3 examples of UN declarations that actually mention intellectual property in the context of human rights. There is the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples from 2007 that says that indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their intellectual property over their own cultural and traditional knowledge. Another example is the 2017 UNESCO recommendation on science and scientific researchers, in which one of the recommendations actually is to fully respect the intellectual property rights of individual researchers. And then my final example here is from the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, Article 17, that's the one that concerns the right to property. The second part of that article says that intellectual property shall be protected. All of this is completely understandable. Fighting for indigenous rights, the protection of traditional knowledge is extremely important. And we heard Ida Nicolaisen talk about that last night. So very, very important. So is the fight for the rights of scholars and artists to earn something from the kind of knowledge that they generate. But there is a tension here that needs to be worked out. Okay, in our context, ensuring the rights of scientists and other producers of scientific knowledge often comes into conflict with the need to make this knowledge accessible. An overwhelming majority of articles written on the right to science-related issues do actually talk about exactly the problem of access. And we have heard about this in other panels today and yesterday too. And access, mind you, not just on the part of the general public, but also of researchers, of scholars ourselves, to all parts of science, from the necessary education all the way to data, knowledge, and applications that arise from scientific inquiry. Access to knowledge, including open access, you just talked about that before opening our session, is just as important for scholars ourselves, because we depend completely on access to knowledge that is produced by colleagues around the world. This also came up yesterday in connection with national security issues, that clash that there is between openness and other concerns. And all of this is complicated by the fact that a large part of scientific research is today carried out within companies and by non-state actors. So as a consequence of this, levels of intellectual property have been rising in recent decades. And commercial interests now play a much larger role in science funding and priority setting than used to be the case. So what to do? Well, as Shahid's reports show, a cultural rights perspective does change the focus of analysis. It reframes legal discourses in such a way that they don't automatically, first and foremost, protect intellectual property over individual rights and over social values. So in this way, perhaps cultural rights do provide a tool for prioritizing human rights and human-centered considerations above commercial interests. And on this line of thinking, and this is where I want to stop, I'm working on this right now, would it be possible to align intellectual property law with the right to science? Well, to start with, both frameworks were originally conceived as complementary systems, sharing a common goal, which is to advance human welfare through scientific and technological progress. An intellectual property system that is aligned with the right to science would not reject exclusivity outright, but instead tailor it to serve public interest. If governments were to embed stuff like open access, flexible licensing, public safeguards into intellectual property law, they would help ensure that the incentives to innovate actually work in harmony with the obligations to make scientific benefits universally accessible. Thank you.
I would like now to invite Professor Wuddivira to give remarks.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here and to have this discussion this morning. And I will be focusing more on the challenges, particularly for not just the global south, but also looking at small island developing states. Because we have challenges that are particularly unique, that when you speak about funding, financing, and resources, of course, we're quite challenged, and it undermines a lot of things. It undermines access, as we would have heard from Professor Porsdam. It also undermines production of information and undermines even dissemination of information. So I'm going to have this discussion this morning in the 10 minutes that has been given to me. Now, I just want us to look at it. This is something that I believe we're all familiar with, to look at it from the role of sound science and research. Of course, we all know that science is a systematic enterprise that seeks to understand the natural world through observation, experimentation, and logical reasoning. And so it involves the pursuit of knowledge and understanding through the formulation and testing of hypotheses, the gathering and analysis of empirical evidence, and the development of theories or models that explain natural phenomena. So, of course, science is an enterprise. But looking at research, of course, research is that systematic process of inquiry that aims to generate new knowledge and deepen understanding or solve specific problems. So while science is an enterprise, research is that systematic process that helps in that enterprise. The a Hungarian Nobel laureate puts it this way. He said, research is seeing what everybody else has seen and thinking what nobody else has taught. So which means it's important because it is unique to you. It is very particular to you because you are the one that is, that is thinking what nobody else is thinking about that particular situation. So it means your freedom to put that thought to use is important. To produce and bring that information to the level where others can benefit from it is important. So sound science and research provide the knowledge, innovations, and solutions needed to address complex challenges, improve quality of life, and create a sustainable future for generations to come. And so investing in scientific research and supporting evidence-based policies should be a priority of governments, of institutions, of individuals, and so on. And we cannot overemphasize the fact that academic freedom is important if we're to produce credible science. And scientific autonomy, as has been defined or explained, its independence and freedom of scientists and researchers to conduct their work without undue influence or interference from external entities. This is particularly important, as we would have mentioned, if we are to produce science that is based on integrity, that is credible and objective. It therefore means that an environment that is enabling, it's important to access information, to produce information, and also to disseminate that information in an unimpeded manner. If good science is to thrive. However, we know that you have a lot of interference that will arise from funding and resource challenges. And that's what I want to look at. Now, looking at access, I just want to share some experiences, right? Just want to share some perspective on this. Looking at access, looking at funding and resources, what are the restrictions that will affect the ability and rights of a researcher to access information? We know that it is important to read or to get information, to read, and we know in research, of course, you have to make reference to what is existing. You have to ensure that you identify the gaps and justify your study and things like that. But so access to that information, to existing literature, it's something that is very critical to ensure that right and ability to conduct good science. And we know that it is not cheap. It is not cheap to access, reputable scientific journals, because the paywalls, you have very costly paywalls that hinder particularly institutions that cannot that have libraries that are underfunded, that cannot, subscribe for this very expensive, reputable journals. So that's something that is very challenging. And I'm saying this because it's something that I have experienced. You have, for example, my library cannot subscribe to some of this. Maybe they may be able to subscribe to one journal in your own area, and so you don't have an unlimited access to all these other journals. So that affect your right and your ability to conduct good research. And at the end of the day, of course, we rely on very slow, snail, speed interlibrary loan arrangements, and also Sci-Hub becomes, something that is illegal. You try to use it in order to access information. So that creates significant inequality. While you have, I was talking about it yesterday with some colleagues here. I remembered yesterday when the lawyer did a presentation during dinner. You remember he was talking about what happened to Harvard University and when I was listening to that judgment, it was $2 billion US in research grant. I said, wow, $2 billion. What will $2 billion US dollars do to the University of the West Indies in the Caribbean? That is awesome, just in research grant. Meanwhile, for us, the only subvention that we get is for teaching. It's just for teaching. That's the subvention that we get from government. But here is a university that is getting $2 billion US dollars. I mean, and all of us are supposed to be, scientists operating in the same global environment. I want you to just think about it. Right? So, you may not blame me if I end up going to Sci-Hub, although it is illegal, trying to get this information and so on. What about databases? And data itself, very expensive. To access data, it's quite expensive. It also significantly affects our right and our ability to access information to conduct good science. Production of science, of information. Production of information is also affected. I would have mentioned insufficient funding. If we look at our GDP, for example, it's not up to 2% of our GDP in small island developing states, particularly in the Caribbean, that is dedicated to science, technology, and information. Most governments don't even care about giving anything for science and technology. And that affects production of science. And remember the $2 billion US dollars. Right? Subventions, I would have mentioned subventions. It affects my ability to produce a good science. Facilities are either lacking, they are not there, labs are not well equipped, or they are obsolete, and equipment with technology, of course, you have the development of new technology that is fast moving, but at times you have to rely on obsolete equipment and so on to conduct your research. And we are going to be seeing shortly how it affects the dissemination of what you do. I've spoken about equipment, and also inadequate compensation. Of course, we suffer significantly from brain drain. So the best in the crop of scientists that you have, of course, will end up going somewhere, unless if you have vowed. I don't know whether I'm among the brilliant, but unless if you have vowed to just stay and continue to contribute back where you are, but there are opportunities in other places where you can go, where you'll be well funded and so on. So inadequate compensation has significantly affect or lead to brain drain and affect the production of information. Graduate research, we know how important graduate research is the lifeblood of what we do as researchers. But it is also hampered by lack of equipment and funding, poor salaries to PhD students and postdoctoral. There are no postdoctoral opportunities and things like that. All that affect the production of information. It is also affected by lack of, in the Caribbean, there's very, very, very poor public-private academia partnership, because the private sector just looks at the environment as a place to just come and exploit and so on. They don't really commit any fund to research and development. And our reliance too to grants, even when we get the grants, you are dictated on the kind of research that you're supposed to do, rather than allowing you to think as somebody who is free and conduct the kind of research that you want to conduct. So when you get the grant, it's already dictated. These are the things that you need to do that may not align with your specific issues and the national issues and so on. And also, more publications will also mean higher chances of obtaining grants. But of course, we know the Matthew effect. For those of you that are familiar with what is in the Bible, it says that if you have more, you receive more. So that is the situation. So if you don't have, you remain without anything. Because to even access grants, you must be able to show that you have the kind of publications that are repeatable. And so if you cannot place your articles in good journals, then your chances are very slim. And we know it has been spoken about already, the article processing charges that are very expensive. For example, I get $500 US per year. You can't even accumulate it. Once the year is finished, that is it. You get 500. You get $500 US, and $500 US cannot publish one article in an open access journal. It's not possible. So at the end of the day, of course, we send it to whatever journal, so that you publish it for free, and as a result of that, it affects the visibility of what you do. So at the end of the day, the metric that is being used is the same metric. It is the H index, it is the I-10 index, it is the citations. So because your articles are not in open access, it is not possible for you to be, for your research to be as visible as other researchers. I'm already being told that my time is gone because I have so many things to say. So let me just conclude by saying that it significantly affects what we do, and of course, our right and ability has been undermined. As we can see, the terrain is so unequal. Thank you very much.
Now, I would like to invite Professor Ottersen to give his remarks. Later.
In my career, I've never felt this sense of being challenged, this sense of being in what they say dire straits, in a very difficult situation when it comes to what we all do, and that is to enjoy the benefit of academic freedom. My background was spelled out by you, Mr. Chair, in the very beginning. I'm not an expert in any of the topics that we are discussing here, so I have to be a bit humble. But I will give you some, I wouldn't say highlights because that's utterly misleading, but some pieces of evidence on academic freedom, on power dynamics that I've experienced in my role as an academic leader for too many years, I would say. And it's interesting to reflect on the term power, because the term power is central to this session, power dynamics. And perhaps you support me in saying that 25 years ago, the term power was nowhere to be seen or nowhere to be read when it comes to the academic exercise. At least I cannot remember that we reflected too much on power dynamics when I started my career. But here we are, and power is becoming increasingly important when it comes to our endeavor as academics. And of course, power infringes on academic freedom, and that is very much what I'm going to talk about. So it's a personal journey that I will convey to you, but I hope that this journey could highlight some of the problems that we are facing currently, because, as I said, we are certainly in dire straits. I should say that I have a foothold, obviously, in the global north, here in Oslo, but also in Stockholm, Berlin. But also, I'm very, very happy to say that I have a very strong foothold also in the global south, having worked in Kenya, in Nairobi, for quite some time, not least as a member of the board of African Population and Health Research Center. And in fact, this morning, we had a conversation with my colleagues in Kenya. This conversation was zooming in on exactly what we heard from the Caribbean. Epistemic injustice, I mean, you can use many terms. Knowledge being ignored and not disseminated when it happens to come from the global south. And one of the things we discussed is, in fact, some of the things we can rectify with pressure from academia. And that is that many of the journals that are being, that people publish in Africa, they are not even listed in some of the databases. So, the knowledge from the global south doesn't really reach the world at large. So, many knowers, that's a fantastic term, are simply not recognized as such, depending on where they come from. This has, of course, to end. I cannot start without showing this picture, because that's the most, I would say, the saddest example of the violation of academic freedom. I've been president of Karolinska Institute for almost 6 years. This guy, Ahmadreza Jalali, perhaps you've heard about him, he took his PhD at Karolinska Institute. And then in April 2016, almost 10 years ago, when he was on a lecture tour in Iran, he was arrested and he has a death penalty hanging over him. I know that you discussed yesterday the security of academics, but this topic comes so close to us when we learn what has been the challenge that Ahmadreza Jalali and his family are facing now, almost 10 years after he exercised this academic freedom in Tehran. So, when you talk about academic freedom, I think we should have a sort of systematic approach. And this is the approach that I think could, inspire discussion about what can we do in this very dismal situation of ours. And I will end up, in fact, with some action points related to these different dimensions of academic freedom. And I'm talking about determinants. The political determinants, that these are obvious, and these have been discussed already. We have the financial determinants, that was also just discussed, how funding, in fact, restricts academic freedom, and increasingly so. And then you have the commercial determinants, not least when it comes to publishing. We have the epistemic determinants, who sets the rules of the game. And we have, not least, and this is a recent development, obviously, the ideological determinants that we see so blatantly being exposed, not least now in the US. Universities as enemies within. And then the geopolitical determinants that has also been discussed yesterday, the fact that universities and research is being caught between security imperatives and global scientific collaboration. And I saw this on a very close range when I was working in Brussels, in close proximity to the EU Commission. What really drove the politics when it comes to international collaboration, that was the security risk, not the upside and the risk of non-collaboration. What could we have done during the pandemic if it were not for a very strong international collaboration, sharing of virus sequences and this kind of thing? But the focus among the political decision makers is on the security side, not on the opportunity and positive side of global collaboration. So I have to go back to the 20th of January. I was in the US. I was not invited to the inauguration of Trump. Well, not surprisingly. But when I was in the US at the time that Trump was inaugurated, of course, you all know this, we got the list of so-called forbidden words. And my colleagues, I was supposed to have a fantastic collaboration and, interaction with my colleagues, but they were much more busy trying to scan the web pages for the forbidden words. And interestingly enough, on a personal note, look at some of the so-called forbidden words: inequities, injustice, intersectionality. It's a coincidence, of course, but what we were discussing, why I went to the US, was to contact my colleagues working on this Lancet Commission report on inequities, intersectionality, and injustice. All the words that were forbidden were the ones that we were concentrating on in our collaboration. So I don't really know how this commission will end up. Perhaps it will be banned. It's a very, very serious thing, what is happening, of course, in the US. And you discussed much of this yesterday. Then I went back to the US on the 14th of April, and I was relieved because on this very date, what happened was that the president of Harvard stood up and wrote this famous letter to the US administration, not really kowtowing, as they say in China, to the Trump administration instructions. And this is the letter, and it was a sigh of relief at Harvard when this happened. And I was very happy to be there at this time. But we still don't know what is happening. Yesterday I got a mail from my colleague at Harvard, and she's very happy with the fact that the association of the American Association of University Professors has been successful now, as you know, filing a lawsuit towards the Trump administration for various reasons, but not least because of the DEI issue and also the withdrawal of fund issue. And we don't really know how this will play out, but it's an interesting time, to put it this way. And this is an overview that was published in New York Times just a couple of days ago, and it shows what is at stake in the US, obviously. What are the concessions in deals with the Trump administration? And if you look at this diagram, you can see that all the different determinants of power are at play, also the ideological determinants of power and the financial determinants of power. And this is such an irony, because what are we celebrating this year? It's the 80 years anniversary of Science, the Endless Frontier, Vannevar Bush, published in July 1945, which really paved the way for the US hegemony as a scientific and educational power. Followed up, of course, with the National Defense Education Act in 1958. And these two documents were very clear. The success of research, of course, depends on academic freedom and institutional autonomy. In just one single section in this report, does Vannevar Bush use the term of utmost importance. And that was when he referred to institutional autonomy. And where are we today? Very importantly, of course, we must realize that when we discuss the US, we are discussing academia at large. Because the attacks on US universities, they represent an attack on all of us. And this is an anecdote, but still very important. Are there anybody from University of Tromsø here? The northernmost university in the world, I would say, at least full university. So this is what happened. I wrote about this in Science Business not long time ago. And they were asked then to sign a document saying that, okay, University of Tromsø will not any longer work on gender issues or climate issues. I don't remember exactly the wording. Because if you continue to do that, you won't get this grant from the US. And then the local newspaper, I think, was spot on. Trump has arrived in Tromsø. I think that was a very good take-home message. So what we are experiencing in the US is not something for the US, it's something for the academia at large. And what happens in Sweden, where I used to work, this is from an interview that I gave just a few days ago. You know, the style that we see in the US, this coercion, this pressure, these attacks on universities, they are contagious. So, you know, not a single time until now have I heard from ministers in Sweden that you just have to do what we tell you to do. And now the minister says it's the government that governs the country and our universities are state authorities that obey us. You know, could this have happened 10 years ago? What we are seeing now is a contagion that is spreading all over the place. We are in dire straits. And what about UK? Well, just a few days ago again, Nigel Farage. Well, universities are poisoning the universities' minds. Would that have happened just a few years ago? I doubt it. So we are experiencing a pandemic, a rhetoric pandemic. And we have to stand up to it. So I have to go very quickly through the rest here because I guess there will be some discussion afterwards. But so I can just go very quickly through this. But the case of epistemic injustice, that was very clear during the pandemic, how vaccines were not distributed in a just manner. That is one of the most blatant examples, I dare say, of the failure of many to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress, as was just said now earlier this session. And we wrote about this also when it comes to the Nobel Prize. Alfred Nobel was, in fact, pretty spot on when he, in his will, said that the prize will be awarded to those that really have done something for the benefit of mankind. Today we see, say, humankind, obviously. He was very clear that science must reach all of us. But what happened? I'm not criticizing Nobel Prize. I'm not criticizing these two fantastic scientists. What I'm criticizing is that knowledge does not reach all of us, and particularly the fruits of knowledge when it comes to vaccines. And one of the major projects that I'm involved in now is simply this, to try to build an ecosystem for vaccine production in Africa. Because solidarity is not sufficient. We will never, ever be able to distribute vaccines or medicines justly, fairly. History has told us that much. So the financial determinants. Well, during the first session today, I thought I should now ask AI, the chat box, to come up with some statistics as to how the core funding has declined over the years. But this is completely spurious. Don't I take a picture of it? Because it's false. You know, it's so difficult to get the good statistics here. But, you know, AI is so eager to please. So when I pushed AI, you have to come up with some statistics. It did. But it's completely wrong. So please don't use this picture that I saw some of you took, because it's absolutely... Huh? Yeah, don't... But the fact is, of course, exactly what was pointed out just a few minutes ago by Dr. Wuddivira, that yes, the funding lines are changing. That's also power dynamics. In fact, just in Sweden now, I was interviewed on this particular issue, and, you know, I don't know how it is now in Norway because I haven't followed it very in much detail. But in Sweden, the funding from the government is so detailed that, you know, there is not space left almost for this creative thinking, this freedom to really pursue one's own ideas. And when every single dollar or krona is earmarked, what remains of true academic freedom? So I won't go into the commercial determinants because that was described previously. But I must say that open access is just part of the game. I think open science is the key. And at Karolinska Institute, we tried really to push open science. And we established a working group. And I'm very pleased to see that when I go through now what we set up as the major issues for open science, I can find the topics that were brought to the table earlier in this session, including co-creation. But as you say, co-creation is perhaps one of the most difficult things because it creates this tension between, yes, to have citizen involvement, but also to keep our own academic freedom. So there are so many tensions and dilemmas here, but I have no time to go into this. But one of the issues that we discussed yesterday, I cannot go into too much detail about this issue either, is what also is academic freedom. And that is to find the peer, the colleague of your choice, irrespective of where she is in the world, for collaboration. This is also a very important part of academic freedom. And in Brussels, when I was working in Brussels, I tried to get the EU Commission to understand this. And of course, Ursula von der Leyen, in one of her speeches, is spot on. What she says is that, yes, we should de-risk, but not decouple. That is responsible internationalization. But as I said today, and we can discuss this later, too much emphasis among political decision makers is being put on the security part of this, not on the upside part, the benefit of academic collaboration. But sometimes it's impossible to collaborate, obviously. Here is from 2019. At KI, we had a campus in Hong Kong, China. In 2019, you know, the laws changed, and it was impossible for us to maintain our campus in Hong Kong, China. Here I was part of a demonstration against the new laws that came up. So sometimes, well, we have to decouple. And with Hong Kong, China, the campus there, we had to decouple. So the final point, action points, and perhaps you don't agree, but I think we have to step up to the challenge, be much more active as academics. We are in a very difficult situation, and we should do everything to counteract the forces that are restricting our academic freedom. So these are just a few different action points that we could take care of as institutions or academies. Embed academic freedom clauses in all funding and partnership agreements. Do we do that? Not to the extent that we should. Quota principles, partnerships based on equity and Evelyn, I put in equality, your word, because equality is such a beautiful term, because it says it says, yes, we might be unable to remove all the inequalities, but one should be respectful of every person and every person's value, not ignore the knowledge provided by people, not to ignore the dignity. Equality is a fantastic term, Evelyn. Thank you for bringing it into our discussion. Diversify funding sources to reduce dependency on single actors, create rapid response mechanisms, scholarship at risk, and so forth. You can see some of these things. And to the university leaders that are here, what we understood at Karolinska Institute is that we as university leaders have to be self-critical. We were not clever enough or agile enough to protect our own scientists when they were threatened because of their opinions and findings. Because some of the scientists that are really threatened and silenced, they lose so much of the energy, they don't really stand up. We have to identify them and support them. And action points at the national global level, well, legislation, well, Hans-Petter, we discussed this morning, perhaps it's not the right way to go, but at least we should go through our laws, Hans-Petter, to see if there are paragraphs in somewhere in old laws that could be misused if a new government comes up, like in Turkey. And human right due diligence, public engagement, establish a trust-based dialogue with political decision makers. And I'm very happy to say that I was just asked to lead the Committee for Science Advice under the Academy here, where we are trying to do exactly this, establish a trust-based dialogue with political decision makers. Thank you very much for your patience. I overspent my time. I'm sorry.